a monster or a whale, they're very tenuous. It's hard to get the visual codes working. So, in a certain sense, this shows the classic thing of modern architecture as a language. It's a stretchable language which depends very much on the context and codes of the people, more maybe than on the context and codes of what you build in, as opposed to language, which is much more precise and.
Step back for the one step. It's a whale in the sense that it's huge.
Yeah.
Which is another obvious. I mean, it doesn't have to relate to this thing down the street. It doesn't have to literally look like a whale. It's size. It's a
Right.
whale size.
Absolutely. And its function is a little whale eating up all the fish. I mean, a big whale eating up all the little fish, being those interior decorators, which are now inside it. So it is. Now, as a metaphor, it strikes me that. Although I've asked Pelly about it, it's particularly appropriate as if you consider its function. He denies, trying to design metaphor in explicitly. But if you consider its function as a center, for the Pacific Design Center for swallowing these interior decorators, and if you consider what these interior decorators do, which is basically to produce kitsch, modern furniture for the Nouveau Riche and Beverly Hills and so forth, then what do they do but produce moldings, classical moldings which lie. So here is a gigantic, you see, vertical classical molding which is not lying but standing up straight. Fallen down, actually, isn't it? The molding should be down on its side, sorry. Anyway, in that sense, in a kind of extremely removed sense, this building is, I think, like the Sydney Opera House or like Ronchamp, a mixed metaphor where some of the metaphors at any rate, are appropriate. And I think, everybody, after a while, maybe the blue whale thing will slightly lessen, and people will start to see it as a giant architrave or as a giant architectural element, design element. In that sense, it's quite appropriate to its function, and even just pushes the edge of the consciousness of these designers and these clients, slightly annoys them enough, and gives them a different code, disturbing enough code to be, I think, a good modern building. Accepting, of course, certain obvious discontinuities in its code. I mean, the fact that there is nothing on the exterior to set up the dialectic between the interior designers and the exterior design here. Well, modern architects, when they talk about metaphor, usually deny it and think it's trivial and personal and literary and vague. I've gotten in long controversies with Sterling about whether his buildings are ships and so forth, and he denies it. In fact, in his oeuvre complete that's just come out, he's written across one photograph, "This is not a ship, Charlie," in it, on page 104, if you care to note. It came after a long controversy. And, I was trained at Harvard in the Corbusian mode, and, I was told not to ever design metaphors in buildings, that was the problem with Art Nouveau. It was too literary and too, esoteric. So what happens when you take that rigorous syntactical view and don't look on metaphors as positive? You end up inadvertently then designing payrolls and buildings which are indexes of, window walls and mass production. Very strong symbols of such things as Norman Mailer has characterized this Park Avenue thing as empty landscapes of psychosis, which is a particularly strong way of looking at it. And of course, Kowarski has done it that way. Well, jumping to the next level of expression, and really, I'm going to have to completely race through this, is syntax. Syntactical level, which is looked into by modern architects. SCSD system by Ezra Ehrenkrantz. Coming out, really, the syntactical studies of, say, the classical period, the Doric order here, James Gibson in the 18th century, shows that the syntax, in the classical language of architecture was well worked out, so that the choice of an order, in this case a decorated Doric, would immediately entail a size of entablature, a metope, a triglyph, and certain not only proportional systems, but semantic systems. You would use it on a bank, and you would use it at in a certain semantic way. So that although you can consider syntax purely as joints, flat floors, and building parts and their relations between them, it also obviously has semantic implications. The people who explore it tend to be only interested in syntax to the exclusion of everything else. And you get someone like Peter Eisenman in this house number 3, illustrating the house as a result of the process of its creation. He says the house is only interesting insofar as it illustrates the transformational process it has undergone in being conceived. So in this case, square cut up into planes, planes rotated, sheared, and put into some kind of extreme tension with each other, and then finally built. The meaning of this architecture, the semantics of this architecture, is this process. So it's architecture about the creation of architecture. He says, as far as I'm concerned, the building doesn't have to be built, it can better built out of cardboard. He calls it cardboard architecture. The fact that one of these columns comes down through the bedroom of the major, or actually through the bed of the people who live there, doesn't interest. It does interest Eisenman because he tells people about it, but he boasts about it, as pure syntax. Anyway, I bring up this example not only to show that architects are pursuing the syntactical level, but to show that, again, syntax can be experienced as semantics, and the people who lived in this house loved it and experienced it as space, as light and shade, as the white architecture of Mykonos and Corbusier. So in spite of Peter's reduction, they expanded the system of reference. Well, now, looking at words, the concept of words very quickly. Architecture clearly has words. They aren't the same as linguistic words. And you can show some of the similarities and differences with, say, taking the word column. You can look up column as a word in the dictionary and get 6 or 8 meanings. But an architectural column is a word. Saying window is a word, or wall, or pilaster, pediment. All of these cliches, if you like, mean something quite differently when they're used in a colonnade in a bank in Glasgow here, in the Ionic order. So the meaning of that column, as against all of those, is different from the meaning of this column, which is in Trafalgar Square and has Lord Nelson at the top and sits in a place where, the English come habitually to have long marches, peace marches and so on. So clearly a commemorative column with a man on top who won a lot of naval battles doesn't mean the same thing as that. And in turn doesn't mean the same thing as a Doric modern column, spouting smoke out of it in the Battersea power station. And indeed, nor the same thing as a column here by Adolf Loos, the famous Chicago Tribune column, designed for the newspaper, the Chicago Tribune column, and the name was Tribune column, so it was a double pun already on the notion of column, and leading Loos with his Viennese wit to design it in what he considered the oldest architectural word, the Doric column. You see, he's matched the base, the shaft, and the capital with the skyscraper form. So it's an iconic architecture, actually, isn't it? It's like the duck or the hot dog. Well, what's happened then is the word column has changed from being a word to a phrase to a sentence to a paragraph to a whole book. It's expanded. In that sense, one again has to underline the aspect of architecture. If it's a language, or when it's a language, it's a much more elastic and polymorphous or stretchable language, which depends much more on the context than the individual meaning it has within it. Another point I'd like to make about words, architectural words, is that modern architects haven't really been able to use them as cliches. They haven't been able to accept traditional words or be able to incorporate these, even their own cliches, into their buildings without blushing or without considering somehow they were selling out. And insofar as they've done that, for instance, not putting the pitched roof word on the top of their homes, their buildings tend to be misinterpreted or distorted or misused. The famous case of Pessac by Le Corbusier is the example of that, where the inhabitants put pitched roofs back on their buildings, walled up the ribbon windows, made them into sash in certain cases, and decorated them according to local codes of Bordeaux. So if one is going to try to speak to the people of Bordeaux and change the meanings of what they're saying to each other, then at least you've got to use part of their language if you aren't going to have your architecture bludgeon them and be misused in turn. The semantic level of meaning is the next area of communication. And again, I'll just whip over it and say that the previous languages of architecture did try to consider semantics, so that Vitruvius's characterization of the three orders, Corinthian, Ionic, and Doric, was adopted and re-articulated by subsequent theorists. But they always argued about it, and they said, well, Vitruvius said the Doric is basically a masculine order, a strong young man. A Corinthian is a female order, which is ornamented and complex, and the Ionic order is an older matron, somewhat more feminine than masculine, somewhat of a neuter, but basically female. Well, in semantics, the important thing is the relation between these orders, which sets up the system of meaning. R1, R2, R2, and R3. It's that relationship. And you can see with the eclectic styles of Nash, say, that several of his styles are being used, which convey similar meanings if you hold these axes the same. Well, this kind of analysis, semantic analysis, could be done with building systems like steel, concrete, wood, and pneumatics, showing their inherent properties and the relation between them, so that concrete, certain kind of concrete, when set against a certain kind of wood, becomes masculine, simple, and straightforward. Of course, depends on the actual type of wood and concrete. And these building systems themselves form some kind of a primitive but important level of architectural signification. Now, the hypothesis is that if architects started mapping building systems and mapping building functions and using overlapping maps, then we would start getting much more coherence in our environment, because buildings would start articulating these functions in a rather obvious, complex way. To a certain extent, you already have that with the use of glass and steel. This is a Seagram's building again. The glass and steel now signifies, and has since 1955, signified office building around the world. And such things as wooden buildings, this is Milton Keynes, this wood slatting signifies home, even if it's bisected by a ribbon window, because wood is naturally grainy, textured, organic, soft, pleasant to touch, warm, has all the domestic meanings, semantic meanings that that everyday life has. So it's appropriately and conventionally used on such areas. However, what happens when you get the introduction of a new technology into that system? Take pneumatics, which is relatively recent. First of all, it's overcharged metaphorically. Where does it fit into the semantic space? What are its natural meanings? You can say pneumatics is pudgy and squashy and, again, pleasant to touch, and volumetric and feminine and squashy and so forth. So at least here it's being used appropriately along with these women by a student at the AA to design some kind of a brothel for oil men in the desert, because these women and this architecture are all squashy in the semantic space. They occupy the same quadrant. Now, the 19th century, I think, really did understand this and debate it, so that the whole 19th century thing of associationism, when you get a formal system like the Egyptian, comes into being around 1830, it's used very consistently on such things as banks and prisons. This is a prison, because the natural meaning of Egyptian form is it's battered, it's heavy, thin window opens, it's hard to break into and hard to break out of. So you keep your convicts there or your money there. This argument is, made and understood and consistently used. And it's used, right up to the 1860s and 1870s, so that you get, for such things as opera, you get the most operatic style, the Second Empire style. The system does break down in the 1870s because there's too many ciphers, there's too many styles, and they're being used aesthetically rather than semantically. The game starts to crumble because it becomes too complicated, too complex. The modern movement really springs up as a result of this breakdown of language. You get those whole controversies, what's called the Battle of the Styles. And if you read Pevsner, his Pioneers of Modern Design, you can see in the first chapter of that he opens with the breakdown of the eclectic language. So you see how this kind of thing, which when it worked was fine, when it didn't work, starts creating modern architecture. One of the theorists who justified associationism was J.C. Loudon, who said, let's design houses with different jackets so that if you have a parson, he has a castellated Gothic jacket. That's appropriate to his job. Modern architect, a girl actually, has done the same sort of thing, putting forward the idea of styles and architecture styles as a form, a superior form, if you like, of clothing. Back to the idea of edifice. And back to the idea of saying, let's let the people choose their house according to their character and function. So if it's a troglodyte, he lives in the stone. If he's a hermit, he too is serviced in this radically pluralist aesthetic. Few architects like Archigram have really done this on an aesthetic level, and it seems to me in this Bournemouth scheme they've actually worked it out semantically, even though 11 people designed this and no one designed it coherently. Just by getting into aesthetic play and using 4 or 5 different systems, maybe intuitively, they've come up with a very good match. For instance, there's the spine scheme here, which turns into another kind of spine scheme, a lattice girder here, used as the main central organization for shopping and for going out and to appear over the sea, is clearly articulated as against, say, the beach activities under the fry outer tent and other activities in this playground, fairground architecture. But when a modern architect does it and it's built, it's criticized by the Architectural Review as schizophrenic. You see schizoid here. This is the Passarelli buildings, which is 3 stories of Paul Rudolph over 3 stories of Mies, over 3 stories of parking in concrete down here in Corb, brutalism. The joke at the Architectural Review was this is the 3 different Passarelli brothers, each designing a different level, and why didn't they talk about it, design one building? Building heavily criticized by Team 10 and others for being schizophrenic. The idea being that you should have one aesthetic and one building system for living, offices, and parking. So you see the kind of Puritanism, the kind of consistency, the kind of harmony built into modern architecture, attacking it. And really searching for a modern architect who can use many different building systems, I've run into rather a blank wall. Someone like Kurokawa and the Japanese can do it to a certain extent, and I've shown this in a previous talk, how he uses the Fryaggio red tent, the plug-in capsule, the space frame, and traditional forms like brackets. In a traditional roadside architecture, now this is the hot dog stand in a sense, because it's such a great blow-up explosion of a joint that it signifies an eatery, it signifies a restaurant by convention now. Well, so here is at least, from time to time, on a kind of a very fundamental level, at least certain Japanese architects are capable of using a rich language which even uses traditional bracket forms, conventions. And Venturi has certainly tried in his writings to reintroduce, say, the decorative molding over the door. But the problem, I think, with Venturi is that when he does it, it really, like Graves's work, it takes a reader's guide to decipher the very esoteric meanings. So here is, for instance, the Brandt house in this 2-tone green brick, signifying a doorway with this sort of punched out brick element and a very slight molding across it. And Georgian Georgian bay window curved out here, signified with that kind of exploded proportional system of it. In other words, this is, if one interprets it as a Georgian bay window, then it's the differences which one perceives, not the similarities. The same is true of a lot of signs here, a lot of his complexities, which he really enjoys and which his disciple Robert Stern enjoys, can only be read knowing really this code. So there's no architect, modern architect, I can commend you really. There's someone like Lucien Crowell, working in Belgium, really working it with an ad hoc language which combines 4 or 5 or 10 different building systems. This is his fantastic Catholic university outside Brussels, the Louvain University, designed with the students and with the people who built it. They all had a kind of say in what was to be done. And you can see he uses kind of two-way grid of curtain wall there and a kind of shed greenhouse there, and this Swiss alpine resort architecture for the bedrooms, and asbestos in a different decorative way there. Or uses, he allowed the builders to play with, rubble. And so as the stone goes up the side, it turns into a wall, turns into brick, and then asbestos sheeting and so forth. That's there. So to a certain extent, as they wished, as the builders wished. Well, it creates a certain joy, a certain wit, a certain delight. It was relatively cheap. You probably don't believe it, but it was. In spite of the fact that Crowell worked along with all the people who lived in it. And it's certainly liked by the students who live in it. I mean, they really do enjoy it. He went overboard. He actually had painted graffiti on the walls. So he pre-vandalized the building in a kind of ironic overkill. But at least, this is, I think, pointing in sort of the right direction of using different systems. But I don't want to look at that, and then I want to look at really where modern architectural language is at. And it's 100% pure artificial environment, ersatz. For an Englishman, his home, his ideal home, is his castle or his thatched cottage in the country. The language which constitutes it is a very strong language which, has a 2-story building, has 2 eyes, has a face, a nose, mouth, entrance, pitched roof. All these signs, change slowly over 2,000 years. And if you're going to hit this market, and it's 80% of the market of England, so it is the vernacular, it's a true vernacular, although it isn't anything like previous vernaculars. It's the industrial vernacular. Then it seems to me you have to start from this point and analyze it and see how, in a kind of, how, for instance, on a large scale, Port Grimaud here or Puerto Benos here, these large marinas and these large resort areas in ersatz, it's an ersatz Venice with canals and ersatz Provençal fishing village in that kind of style. These things are now the norm for commercial architecture in Europe and certainly in LA and surrounding areas. So that if we're in this kind of society where this constitutes our vernacular and our commercially successful vernacular, then in order to say anything or convert that society, you've got to use some of these meanings. Clearly, the people who sell it know exactly the most important aspect of an architecture as a sign. Architecture as a sign signifies a way of life. As a language, it is always perceived, especially in housing. So when people buy buildings, they buy ways of life. And it seems to me that architects, this is one thing that 20th century architects haven't been willing to admit. So one hopes that one can analyze, the signifiers and signifieds of the English popular house and, say, the American popular house. Looking at this building, for instance, it's typical Beverly Hills Regency modern or modern in Wedgwood blue, and it's a building which is almost all signs. There's almost no architecture there. Everything that's put there is signifying a way of life. Most of the thing, of course, signifies status, and it's just that kind of meaning which an architect or modern architects find unacceptable. hoping that status will go away if they avoid it, or hoping that the whole social question will take care of itself miraculously.
But that's exactly what that building is. I mean, is that what you're advocating?
No, I'm advocating that we understand the forces that the forces that are common to consumer society. If we are really in a consumer society, and it's a middle class society, and the middle.
Those forces are such a mystery, or that they're not understood. I mean, the
because
fact
they
that
are.
one doesn't do that doesn't mean one doesn't understand it.
No, because.
Architects allowed to constantly suggest a way of life.
Well, I mean, take the case of Paysac. Corbusier very much writing about kitsch or ersatz in the 20s, and the whole modern movement hating it and always showing useless consumer goods versus useful ones, and saying, we must have this utilitarian way of life, or we must have a Spartan way of life, or a socialist way of life, or a whole set of ways of life which they put forward as the alternative.
Yeah, but ways of life are suggested continually. All you have to do is turn on your TV, and and of course somebody's making a profit by suggesting that you live a certain way. There's no kind of real vernacular kind of way of life that exists continually and everybody can sort of agree on.
No, quite.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's why I think say the work of Herbert Gans on popular culture and high culture, or say the work of Venturi's, when they try to analyze, what's lumped under one word, popular culture, of course it's very articulated, and it is not entirely based on class and socioeconomic background, but it's partly that. It has a lot to do with ethnic background, it has a lot to do with personal accident. But it's those... What?
Popular and culture?
Popular culture and high culture.
Well, I didn't know there was high and low.
Sorry?
Well,
if you read Gans's book, called Popular Culture and High Culture, he distinguishes what he calls 5 different taste cultures, right?
Yes, I'm just asking you if you don't think that you're mixing.
Okay, well, all right. I agree that I'm obscuring definitions and distinctions by saying popular culture and high culture. You may say with Dwight MacDonald that there is no such thing as popular culture, and that's always been elitist, any culture, and all the rest is civilization. Okay, I don't want to have that argument now, because I think that we could really, that's a deep one. I think in a way that culture cuts across different taste cultures. And I think that I'd prefer to use the word taste culture than the word taste civilization, but if you'd be happier, I use taste civilization for all of it. And say that, it's, what one wants is architects to be trained to understand taste civilizations and be able to adopt them and use different ones, the ones really of his clients, basically, and to understand those clients in a much more direct way, and then start from that as the background. Designing really with enough redundant signs so that the intended messages and meanings get across. Well, here is an example of, say, the code of the popular house in Beverly Hills being used in a witty and slightly creative way by, the person who planted it. In Beverly Hills, they always have almost always have curved drives, all these little signs of greenery, topiary work, and cutouts and flowers and so forth, signifying forest, signifying escape, signifying a moat, signifying distance from the street. Well, clearly here, those little signs that exist outside of all Beverly Hills houses have become gigantic signs and jokes. They become playful signs. They become just the kind of, in this sense I agree entirely with Michael Graves that architecture is often about architecture, and the poetry of it is about itself. So that, this is making comments by blowing it up, by covering the whole house until it becomes a hedge house. This architect, or really it's the client of this house, has done something that deserves our admiration. Small. Yeah, of course it's small, but at least it's creative in a certain way and understands that code. And indeed, the interior decorators, who Pelly hides in his building, are doing the same distortion with the, the erogenous zones of architecture, right? Sexy parts, the doors become 14 sizes too big. And, you get Louis XV at 12 feet. You get, you really get, what is that? Versailles, I think, with its topiary work. So, okay, the message is conveyed. You can't say that these interior designers aren't conscious of a slight humor. I mean, that if you don't think that they know they're being funny and enjoying it, they're going exterior, these interior decorators, then I think then you're just simply not getting into the taste culture, because clearly there are. One may say that that the signs are unacceptable because what they convey about the smug upper middle class pretensions of these people is entirely bogus and unimportant anyway. So you may reject the message, but it's the medium which I think ought to be looked at again and really understood as a language and used on many different levels. Well, ultimately, though, it seems to me that the modern architect has to be schizophrenic, or really a better word is multiphrenic. He has to be able to go from one taste culture to another, and there's no reason that these taste cultures have to be continuous. So you might get the ultimate joint of modern architecture, the ad hocus joint of one building versus another, one taste culture smashing into another, and as in this Rouse joke, or in a proposal for building over Dusseldorf, these juxtaposition of 18th century and 20th century forms. I would say that really it's teaching architecture as a kind of radical schizophrenia is an appropriate thing, where it's quite consciously the meanings of this and the meanings of that are taught and the designer is taught to articulate them as stages of history which are in conflict, but where he can design in 5 or 6 different languages without losing his integrity. Anyway, the only architect I can end with happily is Antonio Gaudi. And it seems to me that he alone really used architecture as a multivalent rather than a univalent language. Multivalence, as you guess, is probably can be defined as in multiple ways itself, meaning, on the one hand, the usage of signs, words, syntax, symbols, all the things I've been talking about, particularly metaphor. So he's using a compound language rather than a reduced language, using all the communicational means. You can analyze this in metaphorical or syntactical terms. In fact, architects, modern architects and historians have looked at his structural use of parabolas, for instance, and shown how he innovated on all sorts of syntactical levels. Or if you walk through this building, they talk about the experience of moving from bottom to top, from light tiles down below to dark tiles up above, as a fantastic spatial visual experience, because the building goes in the opposite way of the movement. As you move heavenwards, the metaphor gets darker, things get darker. Equalizing the light, you get fantastic metaphors for doorways here. This one opening on open space, unfortunately. But the whole Art Nouveau language that Gaudi was using, and one must really maybe give the credit to the language as well as the architect, is very rich and full of obvious overtones. Let's look at this area. It was called the House of Bones when it was designed in 1905 by the press and by the people of Barcelona, who loved it and of course who ridiculed it, some of them. The House of Bones, the House of Wax, looks like an exoskeleton which suddenly goes inside above this level. You can see how the lava metaphor is here as well as the wax, and how, say, the designer who's added this blue neon light to it has incorporated veins, if you like, along. So he's continued a certain metaphor. Well, you go throughout the building and you find that it really is multivalent in a very deep sense. It not only makes use of these means, but It's in the interaction of meanings where the important aspect of multivalence lies. In other words, the way in which the meanings modify each other is the key aspect of multivalence. It's a creative aspect. So that, for instance, when you see this building, it works on a very mundane level to articulate a possibly anonymous space. If you look at the building on this side and the other 19th century apartment buildings, they are rather anonymous. Well, here is place giving and identity giving, you might say with a vengeance. Everybody recognizes the house of bones he lives in. Secondly, again on a literal level, it articulates these bottom two floors, which are given over to shopping and large apartment spaces, differently from these floors, which are more or less the same, which achieve the same articulation in terms of windows and general wall here. And then the third area, the area of outdoor space and garden and things that are kept up there, the water systems and so forth, the cisterns, are articulated in this third system. So he uses 3 or 4 different building systems. He uses, for instance, here, these masks, these skeletons, these faces, these eyes, these gas masks, which stare out at you, along with a metaphor of a blue-green tile. Don't know if it's more evident in this one. This part of the building was always compared to the sea, because it slightly undulates and ripples like froth, and it's blue and green. So it has a definite marine metaphor. And when these weren't seen as skeletons, they were seen as kelp or fish. So those metaphors are there. And this extraordinary one at the top, which, if this were a good slide, would show you, is a fantastic dragon, which changes from orange and yellow tile here to blue and green, finally becoming very dark blue here. A dragon which appears to stick its tail up in the air and regard you with an eye open. It's called a slouching or sleepy dragon because it just slightly, cocks one eye open and looks down at you. And then, of course, as in many Gaudi buildings, there's writing all over it. He actually, so he's not frightened to use literal signs and literal conventions, that is the written word. So like a billboard architect, or like, Venturi's decorated shed, he can use kitsch, ersatz, he can use, a whole series of signs, above all the Christian cross here in gold, what could be more vulgar than that up at the top, and bang in the message with written words of the Holy Family and Hosanna there. Well, now, this building always tantalized me as a building, and it clearly has a lot of meanings in it, but it's really the way these meanings interact. And when I was in Barcelona, I found that as a multivalent building, it was much more profound than I previously thought, because they told me that the significance of this building is as a symbol for the Catalan political movement, the separatist movement, which Gaudi was a great member of, started in the 1890s and ran through the 1920s, and is alive today, if you know the outbreaks of anarchism in Barcelona that occur presently. Well, Gaudi wanted to represent the fact of Barcelona trying to get out from underneath the central authority of Madrid and the rest of Spain, trying to secede. So what this building, in fact, represents is not, as I thought, a Chinese dragon. I had known about the, the dragons of Chinese gardens, which sit on top of walls and undulate, and that was clearly one, because, Gaudi must have been reading books on China. All the Art Nouveau designers knew about it, Japan, China, so that was the Chinese dragon. I said, what is Gaudi trying to prove with a Christian Chinese dragon? It didn't make sense, some kind of strange metaphysical paradox. Not at all. This building shows the patron saint of Barcelona, who is St. George, coming along and sticking a sword right into the dragon, killing it, hence the slouched eye, and the dragon has eaten the bones and death mass of the people of Barcelona. So this represents their bones, and their skeletons across the face of it are his fellow compatriots. And in that sense, it seems to me you may say it's getting a bit of meaning in a little office building. I mean, in little apartment buildings, how many times do you see so much? Maybe too much, maybe inappropriate to put all this meaning into just an apartment building. But it strikes me this is, in a sense, to answer your question, a possible role of the architect. An architect can articulate these meanings, which are very deep and very profound, much larger than the literal ones. So finally then, in a sense what I'm trying to say is that a multivalent language can speak across a spectrum of social groups, ultimately, at least theoretically it can, to different groups of people from different taste cultures, and it can speak to them in different moods, in happy and sad moods, about very funny things or very deep things. So it can articulate experience, which is usually unarticulated, and which particularly is not articulated in the language of Mies van der Rohe and the language of modern architecture. Well, that ends the talk. Is there any questions? No questions?
Yeah. Good argument.
Any arguments? Ray, you
Are
must.
you in a hurry? Why is it Gaudi?
No, I was just going to say something trivial. Are you aware that Gaudi played with dragons from the beginning?
He did?
His gates and all of that.
Oh, yes, correct.
I just questioned that last analysis. That was a little bit heavy.
Oh, no. I mean, I would too, because I quite agree that he had dragons in his gates, and he enjoyed the dragon as a Art Nouveau beast. But it definitely has that representation as, if one knows the importance of St. George in other Barcelona architecture where he's represented with his sword, one knows that this meaning is not fanciful, it's actually intended. But it's intended in a kind of light way, so that those of us who don't want to see it, or maybe don't know, don't have to see it. In fact, you can even, that's why it's ambiguous enough so you don't even maybe notice that it's a dragon at the top. It's almost abstract enough dragon to be just a curving, funny roof skate.
It's reminiscent of the medieval, there were Masonics or whatever mystics who built a lot of Gothic cathedrals, and they put in all these symbols that if you were an initiate, supposedly, you would know that symbolized such and such, but if you weren't, it could just be something else. We're now deciphering cathedrals of it.
If Art Nouveau had this sort of incredible inherent potential for complex meanings, why was it sort of overwhelmed by the modern movement and all of those things?
Well, I think there's so many reasons that it's hard to know which ones are the most important, and it changes with time.
Well, your whole.
I think,
You're saying it's overwhelmed by something that inherently doesn't
I would say people like Pevsner coming along and seeing the breakdown of the eclectic language, and then not understanding the way in which Art Nouveau was a language, considering it just a formal system because of some of its aesthetic excesses, not seeing it as a rich symbolic language, which was full of metaphor, which suggested all the time to the designer for him to be responsible for these things, to extend it. One of the things is that modern architecture doesn't provoke you, the designer, into being able to express these meanings, whereas Art Nouveau language was always prodding you, and it was easier then to bring out certain meanings. So in a way, in that sense, the language speaks you, and if you happen to have the wrong language, then it seems to me that you can't express certain things. And so, in a sense, one talks about languages rather than periods or people, because it's not anyone's fault necessarily that they use an impoverished language, and that's the sense in which, in a sense, this whole lecture is completely phony, because you could see how it has its own inversion, right? If we all are elitist Miesians who interpret his architecture in the right code, his code, then those early examples I showed work with other sets of meanings. So this thing about code is very important. I mean, in a sense, it always rebounds. And it's very complex. But, I mean, in a way, this lecture I'm trying to make crude rather than crude distinctions.
It seems that whatever has power has meaning, you know. I mean, at that time, by the fact of its, you know, of its potency, by that fact alone.
The Art Nouveau architects went on to other things. That's what happened to Art Nouveau. Gaudi went into the church, stopped doing any other commissions, but
What happened?
Others moved on.
Yeah, but they didn't produce any disciples or, you know, followers.
It just
Expressionism was a kind of ersatz version of Art Nouveau. I mean, if you consider the relation, Art Nouveau said a lot more powerful things, I think. But Expressionism tried to look to Gaudi. I mean, Mendelssohn and people consciously did. A lot of them did. But it wasn't as strong. It wasn't as rich. Hadn't built up the set of forms and reference system that Art Nouveau had.
Wasn't it the point that the advocates of the internet, I guess it's the international style, said that Art Nouveau and Expressionism was not, one of their points, if I remember correctly, that was not the right code for that period of time, that it was irrelevant.
Yeah, exactly.
To the down-to-earth needs, service needs of housing, et cetera, claim, you know, did not work. So
well, I mean, that's why, I mean, rather than answer that question that was asked of me, I mean, I just sort of wilt under the question because, you know, the answer is frankly 10. And if you really want to go through it, it's, you know, the whole argument for the spirit of the age. One, that our sensibility is determined by typewriters, petrol engines, machines, metaphors, right? So therefore it has to be a machine kind of language. Secondly, the most economic language will be one that's based on repetition. And Art Nouveau is hard to repeat, supposedly, although that's completely... All of these arguments are totally corrupt and fallacious anyway, that I mean, you know, with extrusions now, you can manufacture 80 different tailpipes as cheaply and efficiently and fast as 80 similar ones, and so on and so on. So, and the whole argument for sensibility seems to me absolutely crazy, because if you follow that one, then like McLuhan, you have to end up down at the patent station modifying your sensibility every time a new electronics thing comes out off the assembly line, right? But those are the kind of arguments made, but there are many, and of course, what in fact happened was that commercial society took up those arguments as an excuse to produce development architecture and architecture on the cheap. I mean, the many are, I'm sure, you know, reading theory and design in the first machine age of Banham, you get maybe 10 arguments. You get Neoplatonic arguments of Die Stahl. You get social arguments. You get mass production arguments. You get even political arguments that it's more democratic to have everything the same. You get...
It would seem like he was saying metaphorical arguments in that case, or maybe the strongest. I mean, they were, well...
I borrow a light from you. Thanks. How do you mean the metaphorical ones are the strongest?
Well, you know, it's metaphor for revolution and you know, new social order and all those.
Yeah, I agree. That's the one that certainly exerted the architects and the artists the strongest. They really believed that these new forms would carry new social meanings and new actual content. So they thought not only would they mean new things, but they would transform society. But they only really felt that for 10 years. You know, from 1920 to 1930. I think we've been living in the aura of all that spiritual hope. I mean, modern architecture is still working off that hope, isn't it, today? It's still, the forms still have a kind of aura of that meaning of the brave new world, or at least the new world, sorry, not the brave new world. You know, and it's still considered revolutionary in a kind of very low-key way by a few people.
Where did that interpretation of the Gaudi apartment block, where did that come from? Is that something you took from him, or is that something you put together yourself? with a dragon and St. George and the bones eaten and all of that.
That's something that I'm embarrassed to say was told to me when I was lecturing in Barcelona with this slide. But the people, in other words, the architects, a few, knew that this was the meaning of this particular building, and a lot of Gaudi's architecture, you know, and I should have known that, but I didn't. In fact, it hasn't been published. It hasn't been published anywhere.
It's interesting that you didn't know it. I mean, given the fact that, for example, you started out by advocating a level of mass communication that you claim doesn't exist in modern architecture. Whether that's desirable is a different question. But if you look, for example, at somebody like yourself, obviously spends quite a bit of time looking into meanings and references that even people who I think are pretty good in this field may not always know. And the fact of the matter is that's as obscure as raised as balustrade, you know. Now, okay. What I wanted to
First
say,
of all, there's the real difference there in the importance of the content of that symbol and the balustrade on its side. You know, you may say that they're known to only a small elite anyway. But I was trying to make the point that a multivalent language can communicate across the spectrum. And that, to me, is a very interesting building, because if you want to get into it, it keeps sending back more information. And, you know, I haven't gotten into it. I know that. There's more creativity in that building to be gotten out of it. Whereas, you know, with there is creativity in a Mies corner, that's quite true, and people can argue endlessly about that. But when you look at the content of that, it comes down to endlessness. Well, that's, you know, that's somewhat important maybe for a short period of time. But I mean, it signifies the open society. In England it did, so okay, you can say that's an important meaning.
No, I don't think it signifies that, but it has, there are a number of things that have been attached to it by people who anyway write history, although I don't know if Mies ever made those attachments. For example, Platonic attachments, you know, the form and the cave metaphors and all of that.
Sure.
You know, which is maybe already baloney, stale baloney by now to a lot of people. But the fact of the matter is, it has, or it could have that kind of, if you're talking about ultimate religious connotations, you're talking about St. George and the Catalan movement and all of that, you can connect that to the Chicago. I mean, it sounds crazy, but
no, I agree. Totally.
But you can see that in the Chicago Civic Center.
I mean, Mies said God is in the details, right? And he put the corner detail full scale on his desk, and he built it out of, you know, the actual steel, and that's what he's told the designers to do when they were designing his corners. So God is in his details. But, you know, it's kind of a very Puritan God, for one thing. And it's a God which, you know, is I think, in opposition to a whole lot of other meanings in his building. So it isn't, it's not a very, it's an ethereal form of religion, if you like. And definitely St. Thomas Aquinas was his teacher, you know. So there are those meanings in Mies's buildings too, but they don't connect as in multivalent meanings. They do modify each other, and they extend, you know, they interrelate. Whereas it seems to me that Mies's buildings have a lot of fantastic details in a great sea of banality, and they only interact by opposition, so that you say fantastic detail and then ridiculous searchlight or bathroom vent or whatever. You know, in Mies's thing, it's the kind of language which oscillates on like bad poetry, or like certain bad poetry, it oscillates between being terrifically stimulating and terrifically cliched, if you like. Whereas a richer poetry can interweave those meanings. This theory that's not called multivalence, but it's the same kind of theory, comes from literary criticism and has been put forward, if anyone wants to pursue it, by Coleridge in the 19th century. He called it the SM-plastic power of the imagination. And he analyzed Shakespeare's sonnets and plays, and he showed how the parts modify each other. And I. Richards, in the 20th century, wrote a book, Coleridge on the Imagination, where he takes the whole concept and really pushes it much further, in a detailed way, showing how these meanings do modify each other. So, you can, if you get down to...
If you take, for example, somebody like that, I mean, you don't have to know what Xanadu is, literally, to read Kubla Khan, let's say. And some of what you say seems to rest on knowing a literal connection, that you would miss the essence of that Gaudi building, if I understand what you said. But if you didn't have that reference, I don't think that's true.
No, I don't. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that what I'm trying to say, at least, is that take Hamlet as a kind of obvious creation, which has been reinterpreted over 300 years. And each age gives it a slight different twist, and you find that it's a melancholic Dane who has an Oedipus complex in one generation, and it's the story of a hero, an existentialist hero in Poland in the 50s, all right? And it's this and that and this and that. And these meanings keep unfolding. And I think that's the property of a multivalent work, that it sparks off new interpretations and can be grasped on many different levels. So it doesn't necessitate the fact that you understand all the references. In fact, I was justifying that building before I knew that meaning. Finding out that meaning in Barcelona, I was elated. Because it seemed to prove that
they are multivalent
on many levels. And Sartre, I think, tries to make them that way consciously. But it strikes me that he's using an impoverished language to begin with, and one which presupposes a certain familiarity with the Mediterranean climate.
I see
right?
why Victor Horta is not an impoverished language, and Algiers in 1930 is an impoverished language. I don't understand that.
Victor Horta?
Well, if you're talking about the Art Nouveau, and you're talking about Gaudi, which is still a vital language at the moment, then if that's true, but another multivalent building with a different vocabulary is not as vital. BU, for example. But I don't know why one is and one isn't.
Well, and more or less. I mean, I'm talking about more or less there, and talking about the difference in the languages, rather than maybe the difference in the creative talent of Sartre versus Victor Horta, say. I mean, I in fact do think that Victor Horta's buildings are much more multivalent than Sartre's, yes. And maybe that's the difference in language. So that we have to have a richer language, and one of the ways we're going to get it, and I'm sure it's going to happen anyway, is by looking at popular language, by looking at billboards, by looking at schlock, by looking at ersatz, by looking at the whole gamut of what's happening. That's why I do think Venturis are looking in the right way. They can't yet produce it, but why should they be able to? It takes 20 or 30 years maybe before these kind of things can happen. And I think a change in theory has to precede it, or at least be, not precede it, but be accompanied it. So.
That seems so strange to me when you think that the things that generally that they're looking at, that there's some admiration for now, are really kind of Madison Avenue manufactured, in terms of selling deodorant or tires, all of that kind of stuff, which somebody now attaches intellectual connotations. I mean, it's like selling people who run for president and merchandising products in the society, and that's done successfully. I mean, a lot of people go for that. As a matter of fact, it's impossible to live in the society without being beaten on by all of that.
Yeah.
But having acknowledged that, or having acknowledged its presence, I don't see why one has to jump to the conclusion that there's this thing being done from which designers can learn a tremendous, well, at least I don't know how to extrapolate from that. I mean, I think it's more than just taking an advertisement and sticking it on the wall of a building. So maybe we just haven't seen the way to make that extrapolation. But if you're talking about doing it literally, I think what you're doing is taking the most disgusting part of the society and promoting it.
Yeah, well, in a way, that's true. But in a way, that goes back to the previous question. I think that the modern movement was founded in moral disgust at consumer kitsch, basically. You know, I mean, that's, and so they tried to keep their purity and design integrity by being an alternative to that and not being contaminated by it, you know? And you get in statements of Frank Lloyd Wright, statements about the character of the building being, showing the character of the architect and his character and his integrity being evinced by the fact that he wasn't contaminated by Beaux-Arts styles or by any eclecticism or by any traditional references. And that is the kind of myth of the modern movement, you know? And that myth did play a very important role in its historical period. But now we can see, in hindsight, the way in which that myth actually isolated modern architects and modern artists into their own little pen of socially acceptable upper middle class or elite culture, cut them off from mass culture, and in fact turn them into products themselves. So you get, in my mind, to my mind, just as great vulgarity in the present modern architecture as you get in Beverly Hills. I mean, maybe that's stretching the point, but I don't see any way in which I think that, in other words, modern art, that Bofill and his pattern making, or Safdie, or whomever you have, you put forward, Christopher Alexander, you put him forward, to me, on a moral level, they're just as contaminated as the people who are doing Beverly Hills think, because they're still involved in a middle-class consumer society. They just happen to be using its elite language. But they, you know, from a descriptive point of view, they're just they're working within its mores. They happen to be trying to do other things, which is great. And when, you know,
you saying to be moral means to be a social democrat as an architect, I think. Is that what you're saying?
No, I'm trying to say that, you know, it's to be moral. Now, you can't get your moral purity by leaving the language of a contaminated language, or leaving a contaminated language. In other words, that doesn't any more guarantee character. That, in fact, Frank Lloyd Wright's, or, you know, put it at crude level, when Che Guevara is turned into a product on Mass Avenue, or Picasso, or Duchamp, or whomever, or, you know, or the Corb style becomes interchangeable with Xerox and Coca-Cola, because it does.
They sell everything. So what do you...
They sell everything, right? So that there's nothing more to be gained, really, by trying to do your distinctive style to represent your integrity. Look at the great arguments in the 19th century for sincerity, and they say that an architect or an artist is sincere insofar as he follows his own style from within out, all right? And if he's honest to that and his character, then he'll do the right thing. Now we know that after 50 years of that being done, that the environment's becoming more and more showing these monuments to people's integrity. You know, you have the monument to Kurokawa's integrity there, and the monument to Korb's integrity there, and each one is distinctive. So that
still don't, I mean, you just said you like a monument to Erskine's integrity, let's say.
Yeah, Erskine, well, yeah, I'm not against monuments. And indeed, I think Erskine has more integrity because he's actually getting into this very difficult and ambiguous, shady area of commerce and vulgarity and the people. He's actually working on the site, you know, and getting involved with their language and trying to use it for other meanings than the ones that are given to him.
Well, how do you connect Erskine with Gaudi? I see them on the extreme opposites. I mean, Gaudi has taken something, you know, okay, it's an apartment building. He's taken it and made it into a work of art. And Erskine takes a housing development, and he makes it into a housing development. And maybe a very adequate one, but ho-hum. At least that's my reaction. Is Jesus, when are we going to get?
Well, I did. I mean, first of all, I showed you a very dull, down market Erskine scheme. I wanted to show you Biker, which has this curvilinear wall in multicolored brick, which is a sound baffle, and is more, if you like, visually creative than the ones I showed you. But I think they're similar in the sense that, well, Gaudi worked very closely with the people of Barcelona, both in the Sagrada Familia and in his cooperative housing and so forth. And you know, he was, and like Lucien Crowell, is a man who actually worked with his workers rather closely. So in that sense, there's a similarity, in the sense also that Erskine uses a compound language, and a language which does stem, you know, from the vernacular, in the sense he's not afraid to use a pitched roof, and he's afraid to use wood and brick and those kind of materials, which happen to be just as cheap as mass-produced curtain walls and concrete or whatever is the other building system. So, whereas I don't think Erskine is as, if you like, as multivalent or as profound an architect as Gaudi. He's sort of inching in, I think, a more positive direction than a lot of other modern architects. And he's using a richer language, or at least a compound language. It's maybe not so rich, but it's...
Guess it didn't come out in the...
It certainly didn't come out in the slides, no.
Well, wasn't Bofill considered himself a disciple of Gaudi to some extent? How do you think that? You didn't obviously... doesn't seem to like his stuff.
No, I mean, I do like it as pattern making, and you know, it's... and this is where, again, I suppose there's a slight contradiction in what I'm saying. Given a boring, gray, repetitive environment, then at least Bofill is more exciting and more personalizing and more humane. But it's not, I don't think he's a very... I don't think he understands Gaudi in a very profound way. Although he's trying hard, you know. I mean, he's pushing certain limits, which are nice. If you know his...
They both had a similar problem thing that maybe I'd bring in a personal philosophical bias here. It seems to me, the little I know, that the genius of Gaudi was he's able to take something that, a commission that might compromise somebody else, like let's say an apartment building, petty bourgeois, or a big house, which is bigger bourgeois. And but then he says, well, yeah, that's what's here, and you know, make do, and he makes these great, almost mystical, maybe they are mystical statements, which transcend the everyday garbage. And they deal with, like, that apartment house is an apartment house. It even becomes, if you want, you know, a statement of this nationalist movement, or many things. It's, if you want to use a literary, it's almost Hermann Hesse. And which seems to be the thing that maybe you're asking we should try to do, is transcend the bullshit.
Yeah.
Because Gaudi couldn't escape from doing apartment houses, any more than Bofill can escape from doing apartment buildings. Which I understand is his problem. You know, he was a socialist and he didn't get any commissions, so he had to do Xanadu. You know.
That's a bit of an exaggeration. Yeah.
What?
Well, in fact, that whole socialist thing at Bofill is exaggerated, as it turns out. He's very much the architect of the moment in Spain and France, always appearing on television, and he's one of the beautiful people. But, you know, he does have a lot of integrity, and he has a very nice firm working with him. Very mixed crowd of sociologists, poets, Englishmen, and itinerant hippies. They're doing an extraordinary volume of work, actually, now, all over France and Spain. And he's the kind of front of this fantastic organization. But I don't think he's quite, you know, it just isn't as deep as it might be, given the expectancy. You know, that apartment block I showed here of Bofill is a Marxist enclave, and all the Marxists of Barcelona have gone out there to buy flats in it. It's an extraordinary...
They're expensive, aren't they?
No.
Oh, they're not.
Oh, they vary. They're very cheap, too.
Don't you think that building is not as deep as it could be because the society doesn't have the kind of depth that it might, or the frame of reference that it might when that apartment building was built in Barcelona. So if you're talking about the ability to symbolize, you're talking about a social and an intellectual context that you don't have much to do with. I mean, for example, if you think Erskine is less in that sense than Gaudi, it's if you want to accept that, I mean, it's then Erskine's misfortune that he's alive now, and not in 200 years or 50 years ago.
Right. You said it all.
So it actually comes back to the
We made the mistake to be born at the wrong time. Right? No, I mean, to a certain extent, that's absolutely true. But if Beaufils is going to do what he calls Walden 7, that's the slide I showed, Walden 7, and he's going to make it into a fantastic fantasy of Piranesian space, which leaps up 20 stories of internal space, and then has 8 or 10 or 14-story punch-outs, and he's managed to convince his clients and authorities that they'll spend all this money for doing that, then he could have gone a little bit further, it seems to me, and in these vast Piranesian holes and so forth, he could have put more than just a little fountain, spouting up. It could have been, if he's going to go so far, he could have then done some more, that's all. But I agree more or less with what you're saying, and that's why I said that the social thing plays on the formal thing, and you can't ultimately divorce them, as I've tried to do here, for reasons of clarity, I think. Well, thank you very much for your attention. A speaker say things that are somewhat polemical and then run out without, facing the music, as it were. But, well, I'll be back in January if anyone wants to disagree more privately. What I'm going to be discussing today is postmodern classicism, the new synthesis, and make an argument that this is the first time since the 20s, 1922, if one wants to mark a date when Corb, Mies, Gropius, and others simultaneously came to the international style, which was then formulated as a consensus in 1927 by Mies van der Rohe, who managed to get a lot of different designers, even expressionists like Hans Scharoun, to toe the party line and produce the international style. And that lasted, I think that synthesis lasted for another 3 years at any rate, before Corbusier went his way and Mies went in another way, and Gropius came to the United States and went in the third way, and the modern movement split up into different factions. There was a period, that is to say, when from roughly 1922 to 1930, the heroic period, or I suppose high modernism, when there was a consensus among architects as to the proper style to practice, proper form system, language of architecture. And of course that was disseminated through the schools, and so even though that perhaps the leaders had agreed and formulated a system of communication and so on, after they broke up, nevertheless in the schools of architecture and the profession at large, and probably still in this school, modern architecture was taught. So that you had a situation where modernism lasted as at least in certain senses, from 1930 to 1960. And it's, again, my argument that it started to break up around 1960 into its two major offshoots, late and postmodernism. And only recently, maybe in the last year, or even more briefly in the last 6 months, has it crystallized into a style which is being practiced by 20 or 30 leading architects around the world in a semi-classical style, not neoclassical, not Renaissance classicism, not any of the classical styles of the past, except perhaps closest to freestyle classicism, but something that really has to be called postmodern classicism, or or freestyle 1980s classicism. It's not, as you'll see, a typical classicism. We have the lights off. Turn off the sun, please. And the first two slides. because I'll have to be so brief, I'll just use slides as symbols unless they're important buildings. And these are two symbols of problems of modernism. Glasgow and London, an homage to Le Corbusier, and tearing apart of the... Could someone focus these things? That would save time too. Glasgow, which had a wonderful downtown area, Georgian buildings, Victorian buildings. They were slums, but they were nice city spaces. And they were, as architecture, it was very pleasing and urban and urbane. Then, with the modern theories of CM and so on, the city and the park fragmented apart Glasgow and created slab blocks and point blocks, and as you can see at the top, really dispersed the population into modernist dwellings. For a while, it was a step up for a lot of people, and they enjoyed it. But then, very soon thereafter, as in so many other cases in this country, these areas became slums themselves, and the crime rate went up, and they were vandalized. And not in Glasgow, but in other British towns, the slabs were in fact blown up. So it isn't only Pruitt-Igoe, which I visit every year to plant plastic flowers on the grave of modernism, but it's also in Britain and around the world that the same kind of experiences have happened. And I think one should point to the theory of modernism which led to these things, rather than any particular group of architects or scapegoats. I think we now realize that not only were these central historic areas which provided a certain kind of space and life destroyed, but certain other things were created on the basis of the city and the park, which became, of course, the city and the parking lot. That's the reality, or the parking lot in the city, which were socially and aesthetically and in many ways negative. Well, just one principle of modernism, separation of pedestrian and vehicular traffic, reduced to a semi-purist style here in London. Designed over a 20-year period, which was supposed to be low-cost housing, but over that 20-year period, and because of the expense of producing modern architecture, it's turned into an upper-middle-class ghetto, really a bastion, as you can see, almost a fortress. It's designed by some of the great modern architects in London, Chamberlain, Powell, and Bond. And they won medals for it in the 50s when it was designed, as a direct homage to Le Corbusier. But now it's only people who are, well, the director of the National Theatre, for instance, lives in one of the penthouses, and it's really is middle class and upper middle class housing, but designed for the brave new world and for the egalitarian future, but turning out to be expensive, unfunctional, and destructive of traditional urban fabric. So symbols of the end of modernism, and one could point to many, the way in which functionally this building didn't work, both in terms of its glare and its heat gain and so on, and how it suppressed the designers in the basement, and how very recently it's turned into a ruin with all of these elements falling off it. This is, of course, Mies van der Rohe's IIT Crown Hall. A building which Stanley Tigerman collaged in 1978 to symbolize the end of modernism as the SS Titanic sinking into the sea, drawn actually or collaged in its purest state before ivy had grown up all the I-beams in it, and the other parts of it had almost turned into a ruin. And Stanley, of course, was trained in the Miesian style, and all the Chicagoans really towed the Miesian party line up until really 1978. It was the center, rather, if Mies was the Pope, then Chicago was the Vatican of the modern movement in this country, and it still is. I mean, the hardliners are still in Chicago. So this was quite a shocking juxtaposition. And yet, and this is, I think, an important symbol, although postmodernists may see modernism sinking, late modernists see it rising out of the water. So you can read the symbol both ways. And I won't go into late modernism, but I want to really emphasize that it is a living language, as postmodernism is, and I believe any living language has a legitimacy to live on. Whether one likes the values or what's being symbolized particularly, it is a very strong style today, practiced not only in the Beaubourg Center, the Pompidou Center in Paris, but in this country by Richard Meyer and lots of other architects who take early modernism as a language and make it very baroque or fragmented or tense and elastic and dynamic. I mean, look at how the language is really, instead of being the simple Villa Savoye of Corbusier, it's now a collision of many geometries skewed at 5 degrees and creating dissonance and suspensions and tensions and a kind of contrast and even complexity and contradiction, if you like, that Corbusier would, and a modernist, and an early modernist particularly, would have ironed out. Or other late modern attempts to humanize the language of modernism, particularly those of Herman Hertzberger and Aldo van Eyck in Holland, take the boring box, the bureaucratic large office building, and fragment it, in this case, into many small little boxes or work islands, which, however, are still designed in the purest aesthetic, or not necessarily purest, but modernist language of concrete block and glass and steel, infill, and an abstract language. So this is, if you like, late modernism trying to get over some of the problems of modernism, that is to say its lack of identity, its lack of personalization, and its just anonymity by fragmenting it down, by ending the bureaucracy, by creating internal streets and designing functions in such a way that it approaches say a hill town. But because the architect is still committed to an abstract language of form, because he can't use conventional forms, symbolic forms, and a traditional language, or mix it in with his forms, as a postmodernist would, he has nevertheless certain problems of communication. For instance, notably, the entrance to this rabbit warren is very hard to find, and the streets are very hard to navigate through, and it's hard to understand exactly what happens in different parts of the building on a functional level. In other words, it still is, in a way, a modernist aesthetic of integration in a single style. So in spite of the fact that Hertzberger talks about democracy and participation and getting over the problems of a modernist corporate design, as instanced in, for instance, the CBS building, or any number of, as you know, any number of large buildings, he still, because of his choice of this system, still faces some of the problems. But I don't want to talk about any of that, and I don't want to talk, I just want to mention that late modernism is a valid living language, and I want to concentrate on postmodern classicism, the new synthesis, the new consensus, and just show you at the start very many different types of it occurring in different countries to underline the fact that the major architects, 20 or 30 major architects in different countries who, I mean, how does one say major? Well, major because they're some of the most creative architects, sometimes major because they're some of the most noteworthy architects, and there's of course a difference, and major because they're some of the best architects. So they're major in different kinds of ways. For instance, Jim Sterling acknowledged, as one of the great architects of the 60s and 70s, is now producing this kind of building in Houston for Rice University School of Architecture. And of course, and I don't think many people would argue that it's a great building. In fact, it's a rather mediocre building, but it's in the postmodern classical style in a semi-Romanesque manner, because the area of this campus is designed in that style, and and more importantly, even than the style, and it's trying to be in keeping with that, is the fact, not shown by the section here, that it is forming interesting urban spaces on a campus which has been fragmented into pieces by the notion of the city in the park, or freestanding towers or slab blocks. So if you look at the plan, you can see that Sterling is starting to think urbanistically first, and starting to think actually in almost traditional terms of forming piazzas. You see part of one here with its arcade, and streets and squares. He's trying to suggest to Houston and Rice that if they follow this policy, that they'll begin to create a true urban situation. And that, I think, is more important than the style or the particular handling form. On another level entirely, in this country, Robert Stern's entry to the Chicago Tribune Tower, which I think he talked about here last year, is an obvious example of the overlap between his preoccupations and so many others in America. I mean, if one looks at this as postmodern classicism of an American variety, which obviously relates to the work of Michael Graves and others, then it should really be distinguished from what's happening in Japan and Europe, which is much less colorful, which doesn't use ornament, which is less explicit, less vulgar, and if you like, has less monosodium glutamate in it. But having said all that, I think it's a better building, in fact, than Adolf Loos's original entry, of which it is, in some sense, a modification. Adolf Loos, as you'll see later, had a high base, which was out of proportion to his column. This one takes the traditional tripartite organization of the skyscraper, fits the base into the existing fabric, and then plays a rather interesting game with a Miesian glass and steel aesthetic. This is actually glass and steel building mimicking a masonry building. So it's a rather, as one investigates it, it's a double entendre. It's an architectural double meaning. With taking Michelangelo's order from the Farnese Palace and in these strong colors, what Stern thinks of as Republican colors, not Republican Party, but Republican in the sense civic colors, symbolizing, like the Roman Empire, the civic importance of this institution, the Chicago Tribune, which is, of course, a newspaper, Chicago Tribune column, which has newspaper columns, and all of those puns are built also into the shape, saying that, he's basically saying that, like the City Hall or like any public monument, it can have this coloring, this almost imperial coloring, in any case, this strong coloring, vibrant coloring, because of and symbolism because of its building task. Well, in the Spanish architect Ricardo Bofill is building several cities now in prefabricated classical styles. This one is near Versailles. It's called Arcade du Lac. The lake is here. The arcades are here. He's taking, again, an existing historic building type, the U-shaped palace, which is basically what Versailles is. And since that's only 6 miles away, it's a reference that is meant to be communicated to the people who live here. And he's using it in another context, of course. It's in a context for medium to low-cost housing. So instead of saying, using the factory image for housing, or saying a house is a machine for living in, or all of those metaphors of deprivation or metaphors of a mechanism which the modern movement applied to housing, which did prove somewhat negative, he's mapping it onto a palace. And he's prefabricating, for instance, his pilasters here, 4 stories high, swinging them in, prefabricating them in the ground, swinging them into place between columns of windows, and underneath a attic course of concrete and a balustrade of prefabricated concrete, while corner columns made out of tile, and as you'll see, other prefabricated tiles occur in places which are impossible, such as bathroom cores or stair cores and so forth. So he's mapping then, through analogy, in a very interesting way, present functions and constructional techniques onto past systems of meaning in order to overcome certain problems of associations which people have who don't like to live in council housing or mass housing or housing estates. They just find it negative. So you can see that that's one of the reasons. Another one, and again a more important one, is that he's trying to pull back the traditional street, the traditional piazza, the traditional parterre. That is to say, elements again that were lost in modernist planning and are either lost through direct theory of Corbusier and CM and Gropius and all of them, or through developers. That is to say, through just the natural system of development that occurs in all countries today. And it's this rediscovery of those kind of fundamentals that on an urban level, which underlies European postmodern classicism much more than it does underlies American. Another view of that Arcade du Lac, and here very vividly you can see traveling cranes swinging, broken pediments into place. Here you can see the kind of primitivist handling of the column with its very primitive T-shaped capital, a broken pediment there. And then another mass housing by another architect named Siriani, another new town. Quite recently, Beaufil has designed this thing at 18 stories. He's building one now at 18 stories, where his columns, his prefabricated columns, are 12 stories. So you can really see, and made in the most incredibly lustrous, chemically treated, oxidized concrete, so that it has a patina. So you may say that that's crude, and of course it isn't finished, and the ochres and the colors that remind one of the classical idea of relating to nature are not there. And certainly the classical finish is not there that you would expect at Versailles and you'd expect in any classical architect worthy of the great tradition. You can say that this is very crude. On the other hand, this is not only one part of the modernist part of postmodernism, and it's intentionally made to look straightforward in a kind of way dumb, but it's part of the intention is to slowly understand how the style can be prefabricated and perfected, so that there is, if you like, another dimension to the way it's evolving towards an interest in proportion, an interest in beauty, whereas most of the examples you'll see kind of play with ugliness. Well, Thomas, not playing with ugliness necessarily, but certainly playing with modernism in interesting ways. If this is clearly a rusticated base with a cella over it, a square box, the 2468 holes cut in it on the sides, and a triangular top. So in a sense, we have a primitive hut, one of the ultimate signs both of modernism and the classical tradition. If one goes back to both the speculative origins of the first hut, the first house, which is almost a square on columns and then a pitched roof over it, that lesson, and retaught by Logier and then fed into modernism, we have that whole tradition. Or we have it just straight taken as a classical idea, a classical temple idea, or the most fundamental house. Well, now that is then clearly made, combined with modernism, with these asymmetrically placed elements, and even more directly, the D-style handling of the wood elements, or the red, blue, and yellow primary colors of the Bauhaus, or the token to solar energy over the front door where you enter. So not only does it collect the real heat, but it acts as an entry symbol, like some kind of a keystone. Well, then, this is what I mean by saying that postmodern classicism is not like Renaissance or neoclassicism. It isn't looking for stylistic purity. It's looking for other things. Well, semantic things, as we'll see a little bit later. Mario Botta's fundamentalist classicism also is made up of a series of rusticated elements, reminding us of the base of a building which doesn't have its piano nobile and attic above. So conceptually speaking, it's the ground floor of a building, which has this asymmetrical hole cut out, really a late modern touch, that rather ambiguous shape carved into it to reveal a glass middle. But then around the side, the place where the garage is, it where it gets the classicism pretty straight, with a completely symmetrical entrance and symmetry in the windows. So once again, more a Mannerist classicism than a canonic classicism. There's a very important difference between a normative classicism of Vitruvius and Palladio and a classicism today. In Japan, there are 6 or 7 architects who are closer to the Europeans than the Americans, in the sense they're practicing a fundamentalist classicism, with, in this case, the Fujimi Country Club of Isazaki using a classical barrel vault, the Villa Malcontenta's keyhole window to focus the view on that part of the country club. And then around this side, another Palladian villa, the Villa Poiana, with its curved arch here, held by edge columns that are round instead of, as Palladio has them, vertical members. What Isozaki argues is that there is no structural necessity in the 20th century to have two structural vertical members, so he only suggests the other one and stops it here so that your mind completes it and says, ah yes, Palladio. But we can get, we can do it this way, placing it asymmetrically to even the moment of inertia, because with this as a single structural element, it is strong enough to do that. And of course, this makes us gnash our teeth. It's not, it's not a harmonious arch. And think of, any view of a Palladian building on axis is the harmony of its imposition on the landscape. This one is a mannerist version of that, one that is dissonant. It's also, as you can see, in the form of a gigantic question mark, even having its period here. A question mark which, characteristically of a lot of this work, is slightly surreal. It raises the question, why do the Japanese play golf? Why do they, beat the Americans at baseball and that sort of thing? It's a culture which has undergone, for 300 years had no outsiders, and then for the next 100 years does the whole outside world better than the outside world does it. So here's a culture where everybody is changing even their body in a sense to be ultra-Western. At the same time, they become extra Japanese, and it's when you look at the Japanese school of postmodern classicists, you get always this irony, this questioning, this surrealism, which says, why do we have Palladio, in fact, as one of our references? More recently, it's Michelangelo. Here's the Campidoglio sunken by Isozaki, and here's a wonderful version of a capital and column which he couldn't afford to actually construct, so he's represented there in an anamorphic projection perspective, so that from certain angles the capital comes into being, and from others it just looks like a funny piece of painting on the ceiling. But this is being built now. It's a fantastically large scheme. Sorry, this isn't a lighter slide. Another Japanese postmodern classicist, Shintoki, who's an older architect, worked with Tange, as Isozaki did, is obviously referring here to the Mannerist villa of Michelangelo and others, which has a flat entrance back here, which gives way surprisingly and suddenly to a curved garden. So the contradiction then between flat and curve, urban and garden, and axis, and then you can't, all of a sudden you have to get off the axis and it drops 30 feet. Those set of surprises and contradictions are being done in a different way by Shintoki, who takes a square building and puts a curved building in front of it to welcome you in. If you could see this, you would see that the horizontal bands of rustication actually are running vertically rather than horizontally on the facade, so they run upwards, without a cornice, which is even a stranger contradiction to all canons of Vitruvius. And then he punches holes in the wall. He doesn't have, classical moldings and windows. And he does all of that, again in a mannerist way, by suggesting a face. So you drive through the mouth, you enter through the nose, and you look through the eyes up there. All of that being slightly subliminal and a typical mannerist distortion of a normative language. Well, you could see in the Biennale at Venice this summer that most of the architects invited to design these facades on the street, and one should just say in passing, here's the return of the street and the return of the facade as a double idea that is something to be thought about and considered seriously. In other words, the facade is a representational element as well as a modernist, of course, couldn't really deal. He didn't want to think about facades as an abstract form of representation. He thought a facade was the result of an insight, or more or less argued that often. Here, the facade is representational of different kinds of things. I don't have time to go into the kinds of things they are representational of, and they differ in each case. The architects were asked to design facades as display elements for their own work, and as indications of the past. The presence of the past was the subject of the overall show, so that either they relate to Venice, and we'll see later that whole line is relating to these existing Venetian columns here and there, or they relate to some ideas that are being developed, Stern's ideas on mass culture and commercial design. So then the facades are representational or semantically motivated, and most of them, I would say, not all of them, but something like 80% of them are in a postmodern classical style. But a lot of that is considered to be rather irrelevant or superficial or not very positively directed. And I think part of the reason for that is that the Biennale didn't insist that there be more content to the design of those facades. There should have been a stricter program, as in the past there used to be. If there isn't a strong program coming from society, then of course the architect is at a loss as to know what to represent and how to represent it in a sense. And so some of the things became a little bit superficial because there wasn't a program. Whereas in this housing, low-cost housing for London, the architect Jeremy Dixon definitely had a more serious intention, and he's used a prototype of housing that exists in the area. This is an area of Edwardian London, but because he couldn't afford the size of space that an Edwardian mansion has, he's used a single-family house form to house 3 families. One family lives in this part, one lives in this, and one down some steps in the basement. Adopting a single-family house form for the reasons of the overall street morphology, to hold the street line and to relate to existing buildings. It's more complicated than that, and there are lots of different references in it and reasons for the design. It's, of course, London vernacular brick with the Dutch gable element, and the Dutch gable is actually absorbed into 19th century English housing, so the kind of ways in which to be English is to be Dutch. But it's also to be Greek, and it's the presence of this element repeated, the edicule, the little house, the ultimate sign of the home and security and as it were, at least in the Western, in Europe, coming from the Greek tradition, and as you probably know, stemming to even the Gothic architecture with its edicules. Here you see the edicule doubled, tripled, quadrupled, transformed from these 2 entrance gates, which are in fact also garbage holders. You put the garbage behind there. Through the entrance gate, up to one side, different kinds of edicules over the windows, different again over the whole building, and then most importantly over the front door, which in fact is a double front door because there are 2 families that live in there. So there's a redundancy then of signs saying, reinforcing this idea until one becomes quite conscious of it. Also, there are other signs which related to modernism. I suppose the grid, the stained glass in a slightly de style way, the handling of certain of the brick elements, and again, back to the classical tradition, something that relates the user or the viewer to the natural continuum. The architects at the Biennale were asked to provide self-portraits, and here Jeremy Dixon has given the portrait of his single-family house, which is actually a double-family house, as a face, so it has 2 eyes, nose, mouth, and so forth. So you can see here quite explicitly then the idea which all classical architects had considered from Vitruvius on, that not only were the columns related to the human body, but also other parts of the building were, and as in California, where the bungalow and the face are related by Maybeck and others, you find this idea being picked up in Anglo-Saxon countries. I want to look very briefly at the notion of how postmodernists have treated the column, the orders, and argue that it isn't necessarily the way Serlio or Perrault and other treatise writers of the 15th and 16th centuries treated it as a system of beautiful proportion,
and a beautiful syntax, but more it's a question of semantics. That is to say, the fact that the Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian formed a system of meaning which could be mapped onto a system of building types or temples. For instance, the Doric order, considered masculine, simple, and straightforward, was used for the god of war. Or later it was used on prisons or buildings that were meant to be highly rugged and brutal or blunt or straightforward. Say in Corinthian would be used on churches or more, well, more elevated, if you like, socially or conceptually more important buildings. Now, it's that semantic aspect which has reoccurred with postmodern classicists. And it's produced, as you can see, quite not beautiful results, quite intentionally. The ordinary and ugly celebrated by Venturi as a comment on consumer society and as a comment on the primitive, uses the Ionic order here without any transition to the base or the top, although he uses it in proportion to the corner entrance of a museum. You could say that the volutes, those giant volutes, are proportioned appropriately to that corner. But characteristically, and this is true of most of these designers, he goes back to the primitiveness of the first Ionic order, which had these almost Mickey Mouse-like ears or blown up, almost balloon-like elements sticking on them. And he does the same with his designs for this Doric house, which again blows them up in proportion and size so that they become, on one level, obtuse and ill-proportioned and squat and really offensively ugly, as the colors are. And these blob diagrams here, these kind of shmoo-like elements, comic strip elements, which look like even the modular man has been distorted and extruded and pulled and warped. As these acroteria have been, and these gutai and everything here in these very vibrant colors. So, in a way, it is an assault on classicism. It is the ultimate, I mean, you know, any classicist, I think, before this century would have shot Venturi for this sort of thing. He's broken the canons in the most outrageous way. Not only that, he's made it, look at how thick the columns are. They're only, in fact, section columns. They're pilasters. So there are all sorts of violations. But after one's gotten over the shock, and after one's understood the semantic reasons for this, that is to say, the mass culture which turns so much classicism into kitsch, after one understands those kind of references, then I think one starts to read the signs differently. One starts to see the intercolumniations as important. Stern is doing this too, as positive elements. And you start seeing a beauty, a primitive beauty, as you see, I think, primitive beauty in other things of his that are ostensibly ugly. So going back to origins, as Gaudi said, origination, originality, going back to the origins of things can produce a kind of strange beauty that looks ugly at first. Sterling dislikes Venturi's work particularly, and he's produced this as a kind of answer. This is being built now for his more neoclassical museum in Stuttgart. Again, it doesn't have a transition, though, and that's of interest, that he's almost collaging the element onto a modernist system. And here, in these high-tech columns, you do see a direct collage onto a more classical system. That's in New Orleans. Well, Moore and others at the Piazza d'Italia use the 5 orders because it's an Italian piazza rather than the 3 orders, which would be Greek, and use Italian colors. But in terms of the basic intention, I think it again goes back to a primitivist notion of what the orders of architecture are, connecting a piece of architecture either with nature in a certain sense. Now here nature is symbolized by water, and we have these, for instance, these Tuscan columns being made up, the fluting being made up of water spilling down. As I guess everyone in California knows by now, the metapes here are called wetapes, and a lot of other bad jokes are played with around the building, which have to do with water. In fact, of course, Charles Moore, as one modernist said, puking out water here out of his mouth. There are, water is being used in many different ways. It's not just a fountain, but it's an architectural, the 5 orders doing their water thing. But And it's quite ugly in many ways and shoddily built in many ways, but it has elements, moments of interesting beauty. And I think, again, those are primitivist. If you look at the section column of Labrouste, which led to the section columns of Venturi, and then you see these section elements, you see that here is almost an old architect's obsession with cross-hatching the drawings of a pure architectural element, like an impost molding, and rendering it in, because you can't afford to actually build it, but you can afford to pay the money for just a part of it. You do that very well. So you have those moments of celebration, even in something that is quite commercial. And it seems to me that you know, finally the focus on what he calls the delicatessen order, because it's the place where the restaurant will be, hanging Italian sausages, is not unlike the 19th century speculation about what the Parthenon really looked like. It wasn't. Corbusier, when he spent 6 weeks drawing it lovingly, you know, measuring the stones, he says 6 weeks spent night and day drawing the white stones that speak of the purity, the lesson of whitewash, he says. Well, he, as it were, conceptually speaking, was looking at this part of it, but as this Beaux-Arts reconstruction, and this is hypothetical, no one knows the actual colors, but it was colored in some way, has made it into kind of a really awful contrast, vulgar, vibrant Las Vegas. You know, this is those are vibrating colors, those blues and reds. If you get too close to them, this is a bad slide, but believe me that, you know, those they do oscillate. And here's, you know, a really awful story of the lapis and the centaur is the ultimate in kind of Hollywood melodrama. It's quite true that these are beautifully done. These natural elements, you know, the ornament there is kind of high style, but it's mixed with, if you like, a low style. And in a sense, I mean, if this is the reality, and who knows what the reality is, but this is what at least the 19th century thought the reality was, so in a sense it is a reality for us in any case. It is, in a funny way, close to this. So maybe by more taking neon as a fact of commercial life and the Italianness of this community that really wants to express itself in New Orleans, which is basically a French city or an Anglo-Saxon city or a Spanish city or a black city, but here come the Italians. He's going back to, you know, what it meant when, as you'll see later, the victims of one society became, you know, the heroes of one society and needed the victims of another society. Well, so commercial kitsch, postmodern classicism, and there is that, of course, exists in Le Drugstore, and it's quite inventive. And I mean, this is where one should show the continuum and shouldn't try to cut off our society, I think. Here is a rather inventive capital, which again makes the natural connection, hands holding capital. Or in Houston, Texas, the absent column represented by peeling back the stucco here, but with the capital now of a light bulb. Clearly because A, classicism is expected in a municipal building of this kind, and B, it couldn't be afforded in reality. So it's the presence of its absence is being represented quite clearly. But Hollein, I think, is one of the most committed to exploring the semantic reasons for the column, and here in his transformation of the existing Venetian columns in that building from Bramante's column as showing its wooden origins. I'm afraid that's out of focus, but it shows Bramante's column in Milan, a brachiated column with little bits of wood sticking out of it, and here is that proportion to this one. Then Adolf Loos's Chicago Tribute Cow. Then the column you enter through, cut away and hanging there. So an anti-column column, you know, I mean, columns should support things. And then a tree column or a bush column. And then back to the original column of the place. Well, that series of comments on the columns, and then on the inside of his exhibition, a collage that he made showing how it relates to his previous investigations into the column. All of these, you see, are quite different in radical ways from the way 15th, 16th, and 17th century treatise writers wrote their chapters on the 5 orders, or the way any classicist previous, I think, to this time would consider them, except some odd designers such as this one. Wendell Dieterlen of 1597 wrote this wonderful book on architecture, where he takes the pure orders and proportions of Vitruvius, transforms them into a representation, then, because it's a Tuscan column, represents it as a Tuscan man, rather enslaved here in strap work and odd elements, and then shows it half enslaved in strap work, and then takes you through the column, into the window, into the living room, into the chimney, and through the house with a Tuscan order. So he transformed the semantics of the Tuscan element into everything, including even the grotto. That is to say, like Peter Eisenman, who takes the same thing syntactically and transforms it through 1,000 ideas, he's seeing the mood of something or the meaning of something go into architectural form, until it finally ends, say, in the kitchen with the cook here represented as a fat man holding geese, while a boar's head and other elements suggesting food and gustatory delights surround him. Well, this clearly is offensive to all the classical architects, because Vitruvius and others said he had to be a perfectly proportioned man, not sort of an overfed, disconsolate cook here looking unhappy. I think you see with Dieterlen then where the kind of interest in the orders that we have today, that is a semantic rather than syntactic interest. I'll look very briefly now at some other typical figures of speech or figures of rhetoric that postmodern classicism are developing. Like late modernism, it's using erosions. You saw the eroded door of Botta's building. Here's an eroded side of Venturi's, one of his houses. Another figure that constantly reoccurs, like Queen Anne style of the 1890s, is asymmetrical symmetry. That is to say, a basic symmetry. And here, again, it's basic symmetry, of which one element is asymmetrical. One element asymmetrical. So asymmetrical symmetry was a sign of Queen Anne housing, say, the wooden houses of San Francisco, because they wanted a symmetrical organization, but you had to enter them from one side. And it was just that contradiction between two absolute programmatic requirements which led to that being a recurrent figure then. Today, there are those reasons, there are functional reasons, but there are also symbolic ones. Because Venturi is very much brought up in the modern movement and still has one foot in it, because asymmetry was one part of modernism, it's one part of his work. Asymmetrical symmetry in Graves and Thomas Gordon Smith, combined with the kind of rare architectural joke, the column here that has leaped out of the center and landed here, or the capital that's leaped off here and landed there, or a symmetrical situation started here and then instead of continued here where you'd expect a square, if this is a Serliana and it is a Serliana up to here, you find a circle and no column, and the same kind of rhythms or asymmetrical rhythms created above. So then a reviving of a cliche, which is the Serliana, the most repeated motif in classical architecture, but reviving it in a distorted way, so that it is alive, so that it is, as it were, both using the cliche, which communicates, and its distortion, which revives it. Robert Stern, in his Temple to Love, this building designed for a friend who lived in a garden and wanted a green temple, a green thought and a green shade, as it were, for himself and his loved one, gets all sorts of strange distortions of classicism. The most strange of which is this column, which is an anastrophic column, that is to say, a column which it can be inverted and it doesn't matter. Its top is its bottom and its bottom is its top, and it has a double entasis. So this kind of surreal anastrophic change again in the language is something that, well, Magritte would do in his paintings. If you know his painting, for instance, remember The Mermaid, where he paints the head and torso of a fish and the legs of a beautiful woman, instead of the usual mermaid, which has, well, you all know mermaids. So what's happening in postmodern classicism is very close to these distortions that Magritte introduces into everyday reality. Again, I think one of the most interesting usage is the semantic usage of Hollein, who takes this column used in the kitchen at the Brighton Pavilion because it's hot, uses a Moroccan palm in the kitchen here to signify heat. Uses it, Hollein uses it here in a travel bureau to signify travel to, say, exotic places, the deserts of Morocco. Or he uses cliches of Rome and Greece impaled by cliches of late modernism, setting up a certain tension to signify, though, a travel to those countries, or a travel to Egypt, India. Travel by air signified by flying birds. So again, you know, well, it isn't a straightforward use of cliche. It's a beautifully crafted use of cliche, and that's what rescues it from kitsch. If you look at travel by boat, for instance, you notice that the boat flag is made out of beautiful marble. That's where you pay for boat tickets. Here's where you buy theater tickets. And he signifies that if you really, you know, are a tourist, and tourist is absolutely, I mean, when you read articles on mass culture and kitsch, you realize that the tourist animal is the most, exemplifies this above all, the man with a camera who takes snapshots of other cultures. Then you realize that Hollein is treating a most risky subject and treating it in a way which both communicates directly to that culture, but uses it to send messages which aren't quite expected. And one is that you can actually tour by not leaving home, by staying right in Vienna and seeing one of the great buildings of all time, Otto Wagner's pensions building, which is not too far away. So that sign is built into the building as well. And you pay for all of this fantasy behind Rolls-Royce radiators. So he's using that semantically. This is the cashier's desk. Well, once again, then, the semantic use of form. So it isn't just a aesthetic use of form, and this really distinguishes it, I think, from late modernism and from aestheticism. It's, you know, this is directed design, which gives a certain rigor to the forms, which rigor which is underlined by this incredible detail. I mean, if you look at the way the solar topee and the Indian domes, the Taj Mahal, and so on are being detailed here, it doesn't devalue the buildings at all. It's also modernist. I mean, it's collaged. Its symbols are collaged on a modernist grid, and in many ways, this relates to the modern movement. So, another reason why I would call it postmodern classicism rather than neoclassicism. But two slides to symbolize that it isn't, that there are many different aspects to it, and some of them aren't classical. Here are just two well-known buildings, which I won't even comment on, but just point out that postmodernism, like late modernism, is a movement with many strands. And part of the interest, I think, today, as opposed to the consensus in the 20s, is that any office or maybe any individual architect may only be practicing the classical mode of it on part of the buildings, those buildings which accept it more appropriately, and will be doing other styles for other jobs. So it's a much more plural situation